very special occasion. I want to welcome you to my bar mitzvah. Listening to Brett, I find it's a little bit like perfume. You want to enjoy the fragrance, but you don't want to swallow it. My feeling about this event is indeed it's an inaugural event. But it's very special because of the people who are here this evening. There's so many wonderful people. I'd like to name all of the celebrities. I can't do that because I'd start naming every person at every table. But I do have to recognize at least two. Don Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense, a dear friend. And secondly, former Attorney General of the United States, Michael Mukasey. With just a couple of other introductions, I'd like to introduce the Secretary of Homeland Security, my wife. Important things. Two of my daughters are here, Nancy and Jacqueline. And I would be very remiss if I did not mention the members of the board of this London Center. Ruth King, remarkable Ruth King, John Wolfstetter, Jack Wilson, Charlene LaRouche, Jack Heffernan, Charles Carlotto, and Joe Schmucker. Thank you. Now, before I get to Midge and Norman, which will be the major part of my presentation, let me just answer a couple of questions that some of you might have. Why another think tank? My goodness, we have so many. As I see it, there are several assumptions about foreign policy that are very different from the past. At the moment, the U.S. is suffering from a kind of war fatigue due to retrenchments in some parts of the budget and the third rail in American expenditures, namely Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. Defense is being hollowed out in a way that's unprecedented. This is the real story behind sequestration. More than half of all of the dollars saved will come from the military. The withdrawal of forces and the inability to protect U.S. power has created a political vacuum in many corners of the globe. Vacuums are always filled. At the moment, what we are observing is the visible parts of the iceberg. But percolating just below the surface are a lot of very hostile and threatening forces. The key to the future is managing and understanding how to manage chaos with limited resources. My dear friend David Goldman is always talking about how we manage chaos. And indeed, he's correct. That is going to be the real question of the future. There isn't a foreign policy think tank that is examining options with this perspective. In fact, when I think about unique foreign policy of the moment, I'm reminded of Edmund Burke's comment and reflections on the French Revolution, in which he said, "The nation of France forgot itself." Alas, one could argue the United States has forgotten itself. Educating the Congress with a series of seminars, we've already started the work of the London Center. We've had several of these seminars with members of both parties, in the Congress, in the Capitol. The four have been in Iran and nuclear weapons, Israel, Syria, and special operations. And in the case of special operations, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, who did the Pledge of Allegiance, led us in the Pledge of Allegiance, has a wonderful book, The Last Line, a new novel that I urge you to read. The conversion from imported oil to homegrown products, which is now very much a feature of the American economic landscape, is also part of American foreign policy. Now we are talking about a different kind of analysis, one where we'll not be so reliant on Middle Eastern oil. Foreign policy changes as a consequence. Last, I am privileged to start a conversation with analysts I very much admire. I've mentioned David. He and I have had conversations. Jed Babin, you will hear from in a little while. Arthur Herman, who very often writes for commentary and has a column in the New York Post, among others. Of course, I have to find a way to pay them. And I'm hoping that many of you will even consider making a contribution. But that's not what this evening is about. In the end, those goals will be accomplished. They'll be accomplished because I believe in our mission, I believe in what this new center is trying to create. As I see it, one of the great mistakes that scholars make about the United States is underestimating our resolve. Americans are basically a resilient people. I believe in that national resilience. In large measure, we have yet to see a way to rekindle that spirit, but we'll find a way. Americans always do. This is the essential goal of this new enterprise. And now, for the major part of my address. Norman Butthorst is not going to forgive me, because I'm going to tell his joke. I'll explain why in a moment. I don't want to be an ex-friend, but I have to tell this. The explanation will come afterwards. This rabbi is very ill. He calls his acolytes to meet with him. First one walks in and says, "Rabbi, because of you, I understand the Midrash in a way that has never been possible before. Your insight, your intelligence." Another acolyte walks in and says, "Rabbi, your kindness is extraordinary. It's meant so much to me and my family. It has actually had a very profound effect on who I am." A third walked in and said, "Rabbi, your insight and wisdom is unusual. There's no one quite like you." One after another came these acolytes. Finally, the rabbi said to all of the young men surrounding him, "Get a little closer." They get closer and he says, "About my humility, you have nothing to say?" Now this is Norman's joke. This is not my joke. I take no credit for it. But I'll tell you why I tell you the joke. Because this is not an evening for humility. There will be no humility. I want to tell about the story of two extraordinary people. On one occasion, I was in Washington, D.C., introducing an event, and I had Norman introduce Henry Kissinger. And Norman talked about his attacks on Henry Kissinger, the criticism that he's made of Henry Kissinger. Kissinger gets up and he says, "Norman attacked me from the left, and Norman attacked me from the right." And he says, "I'm a moving target." Now what Kissinger does not understand is that Norman moves the targets. Norman is both the target and he moves the targets. During the Cold War, we had communists, anti-communists, and anti-anti-communists. The anti-anti-communists, as many of you know, were more concerned with Joseph McCarthy than they were with Joseph Stalin. I.F. Stone, Victor Navasky, to name two apologists, thought that communism was benign. Of course, they were paid to say that, but communism was benign, an extension of the civil rights movement, nothing more than another example, a manifestation of workers' rights. Of course, the Venona tapes revealed a very different and somewhat insidious story. But there were those in the liberal left who understood the seditious nature of communism. Heroes in my mind: Stephen Spender, my colleague Sidney Hook, Bill Barrett, Irving Kristol, Gertrude Himmelfarb, many others, but most especially Norman Podhoretz and Midge Decter. The Committee for the Free World was born with a purpose and a target, and they were the leaders, changing the very course of history. When the history of the Cold War is finally written, Midge will stand as our Joan of Arc. Not only defeating the communists, but our homegrown Quislings. Today we have terrorists, anti-terrorists, and anti-anti-terrorists. In the latter category are those far more concerned with the Patriot Act and Guantanamo than with Al-Qaeda. In some respects, they are the children of the Cold War anti-communists. Yet here too, Norman put on his intellectual cape, defining the enemy in his inimitable way. In the book World War IV, once again, the enemy of Islamofascism is defined, its fellow travelers identified. Yet it is not only on the political front that Norman and Midge molded intellectual opinion. Midge drew her lance to attack the excesses in the feminist movement. From her former home in Glen Oaks, Midge learned firsthand what feminism can and cannot achieve. Practical, insightful, tough-minded, Midge forced the feminist vanguard to consider the constraints of reality. Norman simply strode across the cultural landscape, moving from the liberal left to the neoconservative right. Albeit there was one overarching, undeviating principle. A principle that Norman showed above all others: love of country. While the leftists flirted with anti-Americanism, Norman was unyielding in his love affair with America, also the title of one of his books. Even in his critique of the Vietnam War, Norman did not embrace the extremist rhetoric of many anti-war groups. That is understandable. Here were intellectuals not born into privilege. Midge came from Minnesota to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Rooted in Midwest sensibility, Midge always applied the test of common sense to every subject she tackled. Norman was the son of a working man, a milkman, who never knew privacy in his home because the locks were always painted over. If you come from Brooklyn the way I do, you'd understand that all too well. Norman spoke with a Yiddish accent when he was young. Many of his words were unintelligible. An Irish teacher insisted that he take a speech course, which led to Norman's staccato speech pattern a la Walter Winchell. Can you imagine a teacher in 2013 telling a student who speaks in Ebonics, you gotta cut it and take a remedial speech course? That teacher would be subject to an ACLU auto da fe in Central Park. From each of their respective perches, Midge and Norman influenced the culture. They didn't have battalions marching behind them, but those who did march had their perspective altered on the world. Jean Kirkpatrick wrote a peaceful commentary on authoritarianism and totalitarian states, which led to her appointment as UN ambassador. Bill Bennett wrote a commentary on educational deficiencies in America, and he was appointed Secretary of Education. Although never formally given the title of appointments directors, Norman and Midge played a central role in shaping the ideas and the personnel in the Reagan administrations. On a personal note, when Steve Balch, Peter Shore, and I established a group to challenge the monolithic politicization of the Academy in an organization called the National Association of Scholars, its president is here, Peter Wood. We went to see Midge about our plan. In typical Midge Decter fashion, she offered guidance, encouragement, and even financial support. When I left the meeting that day at the New York Athletic Club, I said to Peter Shaw, Midge will always be our godmother. Indeed, to this very minute, she is still my guide, someone that I greatly admire. Norman wrote eloquently about his love affair with America. I can only state unequivocally my love affair with the pot horses. They are the giants on whom people like me stand. They offer the panopticon of cultural and political ideas. Most significantly, they provide encouragement at a time when it isn't always available. And they provide courage all the time. Tough, direct, brilliant, cutting. Most significantly, they are real, genuine warriors. I'm reminded of a story I love to tell about a Southern preacher who's giving a sermon about the end of days. And as he's preaching, he says, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of days, there will be crying, there will be wailing, there will be the gnashing of teeth. An elderly man sitting in the church that day shouts at the preacher and says, "Preacher, I don't have any teeth." The preacher thinks for a moment and says, "At the end of days, teeth will be provided." Norman and Midge have provided teeth for 2 generations. God bless them. God bless what they stand for. God bless their energy. God bless them for their leadership. Norman and Midge, I am honored to present you with the first of the London Center Awards, which, if I can only read it, says, Midge and Norman Podhorst for their untiring leadership in promoting the fundamental principles on which our nation was founded. Given this day, Monday, May 13, 2013, in deep appreciation by the London Center and the citizens of a grateful nation. Please.